Welcome to another edition of Throwing Down Some Heavy Light. My name is Byndon, and with me is Dr. Pat Velasquez, who I've been known for many years, who is a former administrator at one of the universities, the University of San Diego, and he'll talk a little bit more about that. But I originally met him in a graduate class. We're both tag teaming, kicking our racist professors' butt about our race issues related to the history of education at UNO. And also subsequently, we got to know each other when I started doing a lot of advocacy with him, and we worked, both of us. He was working the executive director of Chicano Awareness Center back in the day, well over 30 years ago, and I was working at Catholic Charities, and so we had a lot in common with regard to helping our respective people and groups to challenge the oligarchy and the racism that exists here in Omaha. And so we've kept close ties over the years and talked about a number of issues, and this is one of a series of programs we've done. And so we invited Dr. Velasquez, and I'll call him Patrick, to talk more about some of the issues he's been experiencing with some of this issues going on in our community nationally as well as locally, dealing with critical race theories, the conversation related to Cuba, and any other miscellaneous things that we call issues of the day. So Patrick, welcome to Throwing Down Some Heavy Light. Really appreciate you being here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Hey, before we get into it, tell a little bit more about yourself. I'm not great on introductions. I know you deserve a lot more about what you've been doing, because I know you've been working with a number of students for many years, trying to help Latino students or Chicano students survive post-secondary education in California with his racist mentality. So talk a little bit more about some things you've been doing since you left Omaha, and you are a homegrown Omaha, as some of us talk about.
Yeah, I'm a native Omahan, so I lived in Omaha, born and raised in Omaha, lived there for over 30 years and moved to California almost 30 years ago. So been out here now. When I arrived in California, I immediately got a job at, as you said, the University of California at San Diego, which is a very elitist slash racist institution. It's a research one institution, very selective admissions policies, almost no underrepresented faculty of color, and very little curriculum. So I spent 28 years working there at UC San Diego, and I taught courses out of the Education Studies department as a lecturer. But my full-time gig was as the director of the Campus Learning Center. And our center had a priority on serving underrepresented students. And so we constructed and implemented a lot of programs to try to work with Black students, Chicano students, Native American students, and a dynamic that exists out here in California in higher education that I never really experienced in Omaha, which is also the attendance and matriculation of a lot of Filipino students and a lot of Asian American students from all kinds of different nationalities. So it's a very different dynamic. Over the years of being at UC San Diego, I often tripped out at white administrators that came from the South or even from the Midwest, as I had, that came to California with no knowledge of what Chicanos even are, no experience working with Asian American students, and they really couldn't make it out in California. They really did a disservice to the students at our institution. So in any case, I retired about 4 years ago, and I'm currently serving as the co-chair of a local coalition organization, a Chicano organization. It's called the San Diego Chicano Latino Concilio, or Council on Higher Education. And so we're an advocacy organization fighting for the access to higher education for Chicano students and also for their success. And so I've been working on some projects, particularly this year, to try to get closer to some of the local colleges. We have 3 four-year institutions, public institutions in San Diego, public universities, and 8 community colleges, which of course are public, just in San Diego. And so, it's quite a chore, as you can imagine, trying to just monitor the trends and access and success in some of these institutions. And it's kept me pretty busy, but it's good work.
Good. One of the things that we've been talking about recently, both nationally and locally, and even in Nebraska, they've been talking about critical race theories, the usual diehard Republican racists, and people have come out against it. And actually, I can tell from their incoherent conversations, they have no clue. For example, the University of Nebraska Regents voted 5-3 to allow teachers to still teach it And I don't think they're really teaching it because they don't know a lot about it, suspect, but it should have been a 7-1. The one who brought it should have been the one getting the vote. And my question to you is, what has been your experience with critical race theory and particularly research and the stuff you've been recently, more so in the popular media, but also things that you know about? What is critical race theory and what is it from your perspective?
Well, my understanding is that critical race theory emerged out of the legal scholarship, out of lawyers and attorneys that do legal research. And there was legal scholars like Richard Delgado that developed critical race theory in order to explain the racial inequities in the legal field. Um, Disparate sentences for convicted folks based on the color of their skin, and access to legal services, all those things that create racial gaps and equity in the legal field. And so at a certain point, I think maybe about 15 years ago, I started to read some of the scholarly literature, primarily by Chicanos, but also some Black scholars of higher education that were taking critical race theory out of the legal field and adapting it to the study of higher education. And with much the same purpose, trying to use critical race theory, or CRT as we used to call it, to explain the gaps, the persistent gaps in achievement racially. Why so much racial inequality in college achievement? And so there were scholars like Daniel Solorzano at UCLA. I think one of his proteges or mentees, a Chicana named Tara Yoso. And so I read their work and I thought, man, this makes a lot of sense and it's really helpful for me in explaining underachievement, if you want to call it that, among Black students, Chicano students in higher education. I was also pretty much the entire 28 years that I worked at UC San Diego, I taught a course every summer, and the course focused on racial inequality in higher education. The course was to students who were participating in our Learning Center's Summer Bridge program. So these were brand new freshmen. There were about 150 to 200 students in the course every summer, just graduated from high school, just matriculating to UC San Diego. Most of them working class, underrepresented students. About half of the students were Latino. So they were coming into this racist, elitist, selective institution, coming from working class high schools for the most part. And every year it was very clear, and as much as they told me too, that the students had no exposure in their K through 12 curriculum to any discussion about race or racism. And so this was all new to them. But I would emphasize, that the students were very adept and very savvy and very wise about being able to understand critical race theory, and especially being able to apply it to their own lived experiences. There were many years when students of color would tell me, man, I always knew there was something wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And when I looked at what was happening in my high school, I always knew that there was something that was limiting the achievement of students of color, but I didn't have the words to analyze it or the conceptual frameworks and theories to understand it and analyze it. And they would say, Patrick, man, I'm glad you're sharing this stuff with us, because now I feel like I can make sense of my everyday life and the things that I see in my community every day. And so, a lot of people I think have been saying lately that, well, you can't teach this kind of stuff to students. It makes them feel bad, makes them feel like they're victims. And I found quite the opposite, man. It really gives them a sense of empowerment and a sense of knowledge and having the tools that they need to be change agents in their community. And again, I taught these courses to students just out of high school. From that experience, I'm convinced that you could take students at least in ninth grade, at least as early as freshmen in high school, and they would be able to adapt very well to a sound course, an effective course on critical race theory. But so I had that experience with teaching critical race theory, but also just learning about it myself, and having that impact me a lot and help me a great deal in my work with students.
To make sense. The other thing is, one of the persons I know of is Derek Bell, who's now late. He wrote a book called Faces at the Bottom of the Well, and I have a copy of that. And so I became very much aware of how you have to use a framework to make sense of how's it that these racist white folks, it's kind of redundancy because people of color with no power can't be racist in a sense, but how's it that these folks who enslaved people and deported people, who basically brainwashed people, who did all kinds of hideous things in the history, and now they want to act like it didn't happen and you can't talk about it. And the issue that I think is critical for us, and I'm thinking about Lanier Grenier, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing her word, but she was a woman who was going to be an assistant attorney general under Clinton, and they railroaded her out where she couldn't get it. But what she argued in some of her writings about affirmative action, so on, she says that people of color need extra votes when they are in the minority. In other words, it's like me being on the ACLU board and they gang up on me, or you're in a board and everybody's white and they've had a pre-meeting and then they want to sit there and say, yes, we have diversity. But again, going back to critical race theories, it's kind of a tool that helps you to understand critically how the system of the world got to be that way. As my mother used to say, as I was a kid growing up, she says, you don't think people got rich over their own hard work. They got rich off somebody else's sweat and broad. And Malcolm talks very strongly about that. So critical race theory, from my understanding, is an opportunity to use it as a framework. And so what happened is these racists use it to shut down the discussions. It's almost like when I have these Jehovah's Witnesses and these Christians come to my door trying to proselytize me. And I says, how can you proselytize me in a sense if I don't read your Bible or I don't agree with anything you say? So you're wasting your time. And then they start with their other little cliches and so on. And so part of the way that many of these conservative, arch conservative, I'm going to call them white supremacists is the best way I can call it, is that they stop you from talking by throwing mud in the well. And, you know, it's kind of unfortunate because we haven't even started. And if you're going to have a sense of civility, you got to at least start somewhere to say, people just didn't jump on those slave ships or have themselves in these exploitative situations on their own free will. And if you look at Central and South America, you look at Mexico, and you look at 400 and 500 years of this pillage, and you look at the artifacts that are in many of the European museums. The critical race theories can help you to understand it. So what I'm finding somewhat sad is we're not even at the table. And if you look at the University of Nebraska in Omaha, you look at Lincoln, majority of the people who are teaching some of these courses are not even people of color. So how's it that they can appropriate our culture, our studies, and in a sense, they become experts on what is DEI or McCall? I mean, come on, give me a break. So you got these young people going through these brainwashing machines and they have no clue of how to even engage because they don't have a foundation. So that's something we got to talk more about, is who is in the front of the classroom teaching. Number one, what kind of books are we using? And again, critical race theory is just one tool in the toolbox. There's all kinds of tools you can use. So we don't get hung up on that because we got enough examples of oppression and genocide that they practice on our people for years, lynching, castrations. You know, we're talking over 5,000 African Americans. I don't know how many Latinos or Chicanos were lynched, but I know the significant number. And our culture and our history sometimes is not talked about in these brainwashing indoctrination camps. And that's something we got to talk more about.
Yeah, and you're right. It's not the only theory that can be used. There are other tools in the toolbox. I think the important thing about critical race theory, it has many elements, but the most important thing it does is it just centralizes race. It centralizes racial inequality when you talk about the history of the United States or even the contemporary conditions in the United States. And I know one of the things we used to talk about in my courses was we know that racism exists, but how do we perceive it? And how central a role does it play? And we used to mess around with metaphors because some people would say, well, yes, there's racism. There's always been racism. But if you compare it to like a tree, if you compare the United States society to a tree, racism is just a leaf. And you can simply pluck off the leaf and otherwise you have a healthy tree, right? And I think critical race theory would say, no, race is the roots, it's the tree trunk, it's all the branches, it's all the leaves, it's everywhere, man. And so it's that central to the structure of the United States, both historically and again, even in contemporary terms.
Well, it's a cancer. And one example, I'll look at who do they got as a mouthpiece on TV, and you look at TMZ and all these crazy shows on there and the kind of frivolous behaviors that is paraded in our community, even those kind of things like Jerry Springer stuff. You know, we don't get decent intellectual discourse in our public media, I mean, public radio, public television. So you got all this negativity that's going on. And so again, I think critical race theory can help us understand, go back to your metaphor, it's a cancer. And and again, as Malcolm would say, I don't want no part of that cancer. In other words, the house is burning. You want to pray for a good wind to keep blowing the master's house down. Malcolm was very clear. And here we got the University of Nebraska in Omaha that doesn't have a course on Malcolm X. Omaha, Nebraska? So critical race theory maybe help them to figure out how to get down that yellow brick road, because it's obvious they're in the land of Oz. I mean, you got CPACs and all them not dealing with it. So yeah, I want to switch up if I can and ask you a question. How is critical race theory, and you talked about it just briefly, Patrick, is linked to higher education? Do you know any critical race theories at your college? Or was there anybody outside of yourself that people, I want to say, surrendered around to talk about race issues in either Black studies or Latino studies, or how they call it, Chicano studies or Asian studies? Was there anybody who was well known who that was their forte and everybody went to them because they were always throwing out some heavy light of pushing back at the institution inside the octopus, as Matthew used to say? It's hard to fight when you're inside the octopus.
Well, I would say no, unfortunately. And honestly, part of the problem at UC San Diego was that for a long time, what they called education studies, which would be the College of Education at a place like UNO, it was very small. It was actually just a program rather than a full department. And the person who was in charge of the program was a very well-known closet racist. And you alluded to this. There's so many white people in higher education that have built a career on the backs of people of color. So this guy wrote a lot of things about educational inequality, but he wouldn't lift a finger, to try to challenge racism on the UC San Diego campus. And eventually, education studies became a full department. But no, they never really had anybody that would take on a subject like critical race theory. I never heard of any courses outside of my own that were being taught that focused on that. Actual fact, they finally hired a Chicana scholar in the education studies department at UC San Diego right about the time that I retired. And this was a woman who wrote a complete book about Latino education, K through 16, all the way through higher education. And I remember I said, let me check out the index under racism and see how prominently she describes racism. Because the whole book was about Latino underachievement. And the word racism was not even in the index.
You're making that up.
She wrote an entire book about Latino undereducation without even mentioning the word racism.
Wow.
Frances Contreras is the name of the scholar. She just recently, well, actually, she's going to be leaving UC San Diego at the end of this this calendar year to take a better job, a higher paying job, more lofty position at another University of California campus. So no, believe me, man, UC San Diego was not the kind of campus that would tolerate the widespread teaching of critical race theory in any discipline. So
wow, I would say UNO and Lincoln the same way.
Yeah, I was able to do it because I was a lecturer. I was not in the tenure track. Because if you did that as a tenure track faculty, they never give you tenure. They would say your scholarship was irrelevant.
And I think that's what's part of the problem at UNO is that they got people who are, again, not serious about the community. And again, if we would look at the outcomes, and you would think, we produce better scholars come out of the prison system than the university. In actual fact, the public schools, as we say, the school to prison pipeline is part of that. One thing I was going to ask you, and I think this is all related. This happened a number of years ago. There was a Chicano study program in Tucson, Arizona, that was banned from the state for being un-American. And I remember the national fanfare about that. And I guess one of the things that was concerning me is actually made into legislation, where they apparently let some people of color teach a little bit, but they specifically went after Chicanos or Latinos and said, you can't talk about their experiences. And I found that disturbing. So my question to you is, give me a little bit more background, because most people didn't follow that as well as some of us who are concerned about ethnic and racial studies in a racist society like the United States.
Well, I would really encourage everybody to track down, it's probably on YouTube, but there was an excellent documentary about what happened in the Tucson school district. This was about 10 to 12 years ago. The name of the documentary is Precious Knowledge,
Mhm.
and it refers to the important knowledge in the what was called the Mexican American Studies curriculum. So basically, you had a problem in Tucson, Arizona, which is it exists in virtually every city in the Southwest, in which there was a high dropout rate of Chicano students and very few Chicano high school graduates that would go on to college. So they started a Mexican American Studies program with the idea that it might give students a sense of pride and fortify their ethnic identity, which in turn would contribute to higher educational outcomes. And that's exactly what happens. And you see this in great detail in the documentary. But as you can imagine, as soon as it became known that these Chicano teachers, for the most part, in Tucson, were teaching social studies and English literature courses that focused on the experiences of Chicanos, and including dealing with racism. I would not say that what they did was critical race theory, although it probably borrowed some of the elements from CRT. But it was more cultural, I think, than political. And it gave the students a lot of background knowledge about indigenous Mexican heritage, the contributions of the Maya and the Aztecs and so forth. And it also talked about what Chicanos have been through in the United States as part of Chicano history. So it borrowed actually a lot from what I would call critical theory or critical education, the work of people like Paulo Freire. And that was a lot of the heart and soul of the curriculum. But sure enough, the data showed that Chicano students that took these courses were more likely to graduate from high school, more likely to matriculate to higher education, and they had higher educational outcomes. So sure enough, the white power structure, the superintendent of public instruction in Arizona came after this program. Some state legislators came after the program. And again, we're talking about Arizona, which is probably right up there with Texas for being among the most racist states in the western part of the country. Very conservative, very racist. And so these politicians were able to get state legislation passed. This is amazing, man. State legislation passed that made it illegal, a crime to teach Chicano studies in public schools. Now, I'm going to suggest that years from now, maybe 50 to 100 years from now, if the world still exists, historians will look back at this and say, man, you got to be kidding. At one time in the United States, out of all the possible curriculums, that white people were making the study of Chicanos against the law. And now they're making the study of critical race theory against the law. What other kind of curriculum in the United States has ever been deemed illegal according to state law? I mean, I can't think of another example, man. And so this is what happened in Tucson, Arizona. The governor, a hardcore Ku Klux Klan racist named Jan Brewer, she signed the bill into law that made teaching Chicano studies illegal. My understanding is that after a long legal fight, the supporters of Mexican American studies were able to overturn that law. But, and you've seen this happen, I'm sure, Jamal, where sometimes people of color will have their butts kicked by hardcore racists. And even though they win the fight, they're so damaged and so mortified by the struggle that they won't go back to the high level at which they were challenging the system. So what I'm told now is that, yeah, they still have Mexican American studies in Tucson, but it's not at the level of authenticity that what it was before the severe statewide butt kicking, you might say, by these hardcore racists in Arizona. So this really was like a prelude to everything that we're seeing right now. There were also state laws that came into play in Arizona that made certain books illegal. You could not use these books. And one of them was the scholar Richard Delgado's book titled Critical Race Theory. Another one was Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed.
Which is like a Bible to those of us who have to talk about alternative education, with
Yes.
the indoctrination camps that exist as education regimes. And so
Absolutely.
anyone who's got that brain in their head who understands you want to really learn about education and oppressed people of color have to know what Paulo Freire's book, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and he has a series of other books also, but he actually was exported, or let's say deported, or however you want to call it, exiled from Brazil for writing the book. And so you can imagine the mentality level. And I was surprised when I read the book, Patrick, in post-secondary education, how many educators didn't use the book. I mean, we're talking about education and helping minority and students of color and people who are at the bottom economically. I don't know any professor in the Department of Education that used that as a textbook in the Department of Education in Lincoln or in Omaha.
Yeah, I read the book in my doctoral studies here in San Diego. So I was fortunate. I had a very strong Chicano professor and mentor, and he did have us read Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And we talked at length about Freire. And you're right. There's no one that teaches an emancipatory form of education that's meant to empower students of color. I think that doesn't, whose methods are not informed in some way by Freire's work.
You know, other thing comes, what is the connection between the current activism among conservatives to ban teaching of critical race theory, especially in high school, in which has seldom been taught, and the widespread allegiance to the Donald Trump amongst many racist white people? In other words, there are people who ask that question because they've seen the racism and the vehement and the negativity that came out of Donald Trump's mouth, and you still have 70 million people vote for him. So help me understand that, because I'm still trying to figure out this time traveling that we're in, that we must be in the twilight zone or in a nightmare, because it's like 70 million people voted for that clown after what he did and said and just behaved. And I mean, it's like, help me with that one.
Well, I think what we're seeing, and certainly there are many people before me who have pointed out the increased polarization in the United States. And also, if you really boil down the essence of Donald Trump's, his politics, if you will, that it amounts to a Nazi or neo-Nazi form of fascism. Now, if you know Donald Trump, he's not a very bright person. He's got a strong instinct for survival, which a lot of really unintelligent white people have. I've seen a lot of white people at the university weren't very smart, but man, they had almost like an instinct for self-preservation. And so that's Trump. He's not an ideological leader in any sense, right? However, some of his supporters, like Steve Bannon or a guy named Stephen Miller, who really shaped Trump's immigration policy, these guys do have ideologies, and it basically amounts to fascism. So they see part of, I think, I don't know how you feel about this, but I've heard discussions in California where people are saying that in states like California, and this was even before Trump, that in states like California, we're in the situation that South Africa was in when Nelson Mandela was in prison, where here we are as people of color, the majority of the state of California's population, but virtually powerless, right? White people still control the political decisions for the most part in California. And I think that's a microcosm of the country. As the population of Chicanos, African Americans, Asian Americans grows all across the country, you're starting to see a little bit of flexing of political power. And that has racist white people completely freaked out.
Right.
So the Steve Bannons, the Stephen Millers of the world are saying, we have to put a stop to this. We can't let these people of color assume any degree of power. We cannot lose our white privilege above all else. And so they're trying to look at what are some of the neo-Nazi strategies of fascism that will allow us to hold power and privilege.
Right.
This is where critical race theory, the banning of critical race theory in schools comes into play. Because if you can control the education of people of color and their socialization largely, then you can control their political power. So I think they see this kind of curriculum is really core, really important to their fascist strategies of maintaining power and privilege. In California, we see somewhat the opposite, because the movement in the last few years has been state legislation that makes the study of, or makes the teaching of ethnic studies mandatory in California. So one of our public university systems, the California State Universities, just passed this law about 2 years ago. So now every student that goes to the California State University can't graduate without taking at least one course in ethnic studies. So that's the trend. They're trying to do the same thing with California community colleges now. But in other states, again, like Arizona, Texas, where the white power structure is still firmly in place, the movement's been just to the opposite and to ban ethnic studies, or in this case, critical race theory.
You know, as you say that, one of the things that hit me is that even though we sometimes will have ethnic and racial studies at UNO, you look at who's teaching them. There's a couple of white women who live in Bellevue who've never been to North Omaha, I don't think, in their life. You got some other, I remember in a social work department, they brought some white professor guy who just graduated, and he basically said out of his mouth to me is that he got stuck with the diversity course. And then when he invited me to come and speak in his class, he had his students reading the New York Times for part of their textbook. And I'm like, what? And the New York Times articles he shared with me when I was in the class were the milquetoast DEI types crap that people run around here who are at the elementary level. But the other point that I think we don't have, and I will argue this emphatically, if you don't have a system that's turning out, again, it's like if you go to a car factory, if you go to any entity and you turn out poor products, that's like buying Bose speakers or any of those nice speakers, cost, whatever the name is, and they don't work, then how can you talk about how great they are? Amazon couldn't sell the education we get in our community, because if you look at the number of kids in OPS, Omaha Plantation Schools, they're roughly 70% of the student body. You go to the University of Nebraska, Omaha, University of No Opportunity, we call it. You go to UNL, you go to Kearney, any of these places. The graduation rate of students of color, particularly African Americans, are dismal. You may have more people from other countries that are African or born on the continent graduating than indigenous Africans or Latinos who grew up in this community. And so part of the thing I would argue is that many of the academicians that we have are not educating those students to survive or even do what they need to do. So if we're going to be serious about looking at our educational system, you need to look at the end results, not all the flip-flop stuff that they do today, because at the end of the day, some of these courses are nothing but entertainment. I had my younger sister took a Black Studies course years ago, and she told me one of the professors were using Ebony and Jet as a textbook. Now, I know she wasn't making that up, and I've actually seen professors use film, one film after another film, instead of dealing with realities of our community. So again, that's part of the problem that we have in our communities, that our education system, not only in post-secondary, but even secondary and elementary, does as Bob Marley says, educate us to be the fools. And that's what's going on. And we can see that today. I'm going to switch up if I can and ask you a little bit about Cuba. And I know lately after the current president got into office, he became kind of a gun-ho conservative Trumpite on Cuba. And, there's been a little protest in Cuba. And, those of us who know a little about Cuba know that Fidel did more for many African countries than all these other so-called people, and particularly in South Africa, Angola, and Mozambique. And even Mandela made a comment about that when he was in the United States. He told Ted Koppel that your enemy is not my enemy. And again, Ted Koppel was trying to get Mandela to shoot down Fidel Castro, who is considered the lion of the struggle, as we would say. So my question is, what is our knowledge, or what is your experience of Cuba? And I know you've been to Cuba more than I have. I just flew over when I was going to Africa the first time, going to Brazil, to South Africa, to Botswana. So I only know Cuba from about 70,000 feet up in the sky, and I get the chance to speak to any Cubanos. So talk a little bit more about your experience of Cuba and some of the Black beings that we've experienced in living in the United States.
Sure. Well, I became intrigued with Cuba very early in my experiences as a Chicano activist back in Omaha. And, this was in the mid 1970s. And, I've written a long paper about the comparison between what happened in Cuba since Fidel and Che Guevara and the other revolutionaries took over the country in 1959, what happened in Cuba and what's happened to Chicanos, people of Mexican origin, in the United States, because I think there are some strong parallels there in terms of struggles for liberation, struggles for decolonization, as we call it. And so I became very intrigued with just the fact that Cuba, very early after the revolution, Fidel Castro basically told the United States to go to hell. And he said, I don't need you as an ally, because all the United States wanted to do with Fidel as leader was to continue the patterns of gambling, prostitution, drugs, and so forth that existed in Cuba. And Cuba was basically a playground for people from the United States.
In other words, Patrick, if I'm understanding well, and I think I saw a couple of movies, it was like Las Vegas, but it was only in Cuba.
Yeah, it was like Las Vegas on steroids, man.
Oh, wow.
A lot worse, the worst of everything, right? And so Fidel wanted to change all that. And when he saw that the United States would not be his ally in that kind of a movement, he struck out on his own. And so I also found out sometime maybe in the late 70s, I think I read a book called The Making of a New People, which was about the literacy movement in Cuba after the revolution, because before Fidel, hardly anybody went to school. Only the wealthy went to school in Cuba. And illiteracy was a major problem. So that was one of the first things that, I'll call it the Castro Revolution, took on, was to improve the literacy of people. And they had this massively effective program of literacy in Cuba, which is still one of their areas of pride. So when I was at UC San Diego, I started doing more research on the education system in Cuba. And I read a book called Cuba's Academic Advantage by a white scholar at Stanford University named Martin Carnoy. And his book documents the high rate of educational achievement in Cuba compared to almost all other Latin American countries. And so I thought, well, I need to find out more of this, because of course, one of the major issues, one of the major results of racism against Chicanos in the United States is low rates of educational achievement in our communities. So I wanted to see if Cuba could offer any clues as to how we might improve the education of Chicanos. So long story short, I've been to Cuba now over a half a dozen times. I probably spent in total about 2.5 months in Cuba. And I've gone on very organized trips where we had very structured dialogues with Cuban educators in the K-12 system, in higher education, in vocational schools and universities. I've done qualitative interviews with Cuban scholars, with Cuban social workers, and had numerous conversations with Cuban people over the years. I still keep in touch with a number of friends in Cuba. So what I found is that there are some things that, I could talk for days about this, but there's a number of things that take place in Cuban schools I think could be adopted for use in Chicano schools in the United States. But, a lot of it just boils down to a very explicit effort to decolonize and to not put white people on a pedestal, to not look at white culture as the model through which we can liberate ourselves. And so there's a lot, again, of Paulo Freire in the educational strategies that have been utilized in Cuba. And they will tell you that.
As you mentioned that, if we would adapt some of those models, you would not see the kind of results of the school to prison pipeline, because, again, in this day and age, you shouldn't have as many people of color, particularly African Americans or Latinos or Hispanics or Chicanos, going to prison over stuff that they let white people get exemption for. And all you have to do is go to traffic court. All you got to do is go to the Lincoln prison system or Omaha prison system. And again, some of these victimless crimes, people should not get that time. We've allowed the police officers a free pass for many years. We've allowed the judges. And I'm also thinking about all the people who've been killed of color by police officers, and police officers never brought charges. I mean, those are the traumatic experiences that we as African Americans have experienced, the same way people run scared of the Taliban. As Ernie said, the American government has done the Taliban to us for 400 and 500 years, and we don't want to talk about it. Well, if you don't talk about the trauma, how can you heal and how can you go forward? Because again, it is no accident that certain people stay at the top through the tax system, through the educational system, through you name it, healthcare system, anything that you point to, you see many of us always at the bottom. Not to say that not some successes, but at the end of the day, if we don't know our history and we don't talk about what happens in Cuba and happened in South Africa or what happened in Angola, Mozambique, Botswana, you name it, all of this is all related. And the colonization of many of these indigenous countries from Central and South America, and then some of them they call now Banana Republic, they're known for producing bananas and things, that reflects the historical oppression. And if you don't deconstruct that, you're gonna walk around here with your head in TMZ dealing with that kind of education, because again, it's that microwave stuff that keeps people stuck on stupid.
Yeah, as far back as the 1970s, there were Black scholars like Hamilton and Carmichael, Chicano scholars like Barrera, Munoz. They were writing about internal colonialism
Right.
in communities of color. And so what you're talking about is very true, man. The same colonization of what I would call countries of color, which people of color are the majority, that same kind of colonialism is not much different at all than what's been practiced against communities of color in the United States.
Right. You can turn off the water in North Omaha and many people would be in bad shape. In other words, we oftentimes have to go outside of our community to get any of the basic supplies. I mean, if they're like this, COVID-19 is a good example. We have health departments that can't figure out how to reach penetration of giving immunization to communities because they don't have people on their staff who look like the very people they want to serve. You have people who are inside of our communities who don't live in our communities. They come and work and then they extract the natural resources or the public funds and you don't see them again. Just recently, Senator McKinney had a bill, a legislation resolution where he talked about all these nonprofits in our community, and he basically said some of us call them poverty pimps. They don't have people of color on their board of directors. They don't have any produce any outcomes. You look at things are getting worse. You got young kids doing drive-bys and shooting each other. How does that happen? Okay, because people have been taught, as Malcolm X says, to hate yourself or don't see the value of your neighbor or people who are involved in the struggle. And so when you do what we do in this society, you get the results. And then when you have absence of fathers, I see some of these women running around as if they birthed these children by themselves. I had one of the county attorney meeting, I heard from someone of my colleague that they said the men were nothing but sperm banks. I mean, how do you say it in a public meeting and you work for the government? Now he came back and shared it with me, Dave, who worked with me, shared that story with me because he says nobody in the room challenged it. So again, if you're demonizing, again, when I look at the Buffett Institute Early Childhood Education, I won't see a brown or black face in there on their staff. They're all women. How does that work? Okay. And how do you get organizations that there are no men or no balance of families? And if they're not protecting the family, and I'm including children because they come part of the unit, I'm including men and women, but we don't need these Karens and Becky's running up doing our stuff that we're supposed to be doing naturally. I'm going to come back to this Cuba thing a little bit. If we took the Cuban model and look at the historical relationships in contemporary times, do you believe we can actually change the internal colonization that you just alluded to, Patrick?
Well, I think it would be part of the answer. Probably not all the answers are there, but I think, again, there are a number of things that we could use from the Cuban model. And some of it, again, is very intuitive or very basic in terms of just developing pride. You know, I looked very closely in my research on all the studies done about ethnic identity among students of color in the United States. And the research seems very clear that when Black students and Chicano students, Native American students, when they understand their experience, they know their history and their culture, they're proud of who they are, that's like a suit of armor. So
Right.
that's when they go to a place like UNO or UC San Diego that's so racist that they can deflect that racism and they can keep their eyes on their goals and their objectives, and then also return to the community once they get their educational credentials. So, you know, I also had the experience of taking two groups of Latino students from UC San Diego to visit Cuba for a week and to study
Wow.
there with Cuban scholars. And we learned a lot about the history of Cuba. And I think it's very important for people to understand, because some of the students would ask me, like, how is it that the United States has a military base in Guantanamo, Cuba, where they have all these suspected terrorists locked up, most of them not even charged with a crime?
Right.
How did we get a military base in Cuba? And you can look at history. I always recommend the Cuban American scholar Luis Perez is a great source of Cuban history, especially in the relationship with the United States. But basically, the United States just took it. They said, hey, man, we're taking it. And too bad. You don't have a military like ours, so we're taking it.
So you're saying the American government just went and took that
They
place?
just took it. You know,
Wow.
when Cuba overthrew Spain and declared its independence in the early 20th century, as soon as the Spanish were kicked out of Cuba, the United States moved in and virtually colonized Cuba. And they pretty much ran Cuba like their colony all the way up until the Castro Revolution in 1959.
Wow.
So that's the basic relationship. And you know, when Fidel took over, he nationalized a lot of the resources in Cuba. And all those American companies that come in and were stealing natural resources, you know, exporting steel and nickel and sugar and coffee, he took those resources back for the Cuban people. And the United States never forgave him for that. And I think that's why Bill Clinton, that racist punk, Bill Clinton in the 1990s signed into law a bill passed by the United States Senate that created the present economic embargo by the United States against Cuba, where the United States will not trade with Cuba. The United States forbids its allies from trading with Cuba. I had my friends in Cuba telling me that during the Trump administration, there were ships from Europe that were trying to bring medical supplies to Cuba during the pandemic, and those ships were stopped on the high seas by American ships and told to turn around and go back, that they were not going to let them bring those medical supplies to Cuba.
Wow.
So that embargo is deliberately trying to starve and kill the Cuban people for the express purpose of overthrowing the government of Cuba. It's one of
Wow.
the cruelest policies that I think we've ever seen in the United States. And again, historians will write about this 100 years from now and say, unbelievable that any country could be so cruel.
You know, it's the same mentality of police officers defending the killing of George Floyd, or the case of the guy in Colorado where, you know, we had Richard Kellum where they arrested him and they beat him to death, and not one of those police officers saw any jail time. And what made it even more embarrassing, there was an African American I found out from another police officer who was in charge of the jail, African American female, who later got promoted all the way up through the ranks. And so again, you have this same kind of brutality against African Americans, and I think that's something that Ernie fought against for many years when he had the grand jury called in. But again, the latest county attorney did something what was unusual. Instead of having to call the grand jury for each case like they're supposed to, according to law, he had the grand jury call for like 10 at one time. And so they got together. I suspect they had some popcorn and some Coca-Cola and just basically ramrodded, you know, these okay situation, justifiable situations, when each one of them should have been meticulously examined and so on. I want to switch up if I can just a little bit, and again, I know we don't have a lot of time, but one of the things that you talked about was this boycott and so on, and you talked a little bit about the blockade more than anything. And what I'm trying to figure out, and how do we reverse that? It's been, you know, this Byndon, I would say Byndon, my name, Byndon administration stands for Cuba during this crisis. So what has it been like from your vantage point? And what are the implications of the United Nations, of the 2021 vote as member countries try to stop that blockading, again, stop the United States from boycotting Cuba? And I think Israel and the United States are the only one who were against that. But tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, this has been an annual exercise, you might say, in the United Nations, probably for the last 10 years, where every year there's a vote in the United States to either support or eliminate the United States economic blockade of Cuba, because this is a violation of international law. And the vote took place again just in June of 2016, a couple of months ago. And the vote, as you said, was 184 countries to oppose the blockade and only two countries to support it. Those two countries being the United States and Israel. You know, and the thing that I would bear in mind about this is all the crap that we hear from the Democratic Party and people like Joe Biden and his ilk about preserving democracy in the United States. Now, he had a meeting with a bunch of very conservative neo-fascist Cuban Americans, the type of people whose forefathers probably were kicked out of Cuba or left Cuba after Fidel took over. And again, hardcore racist Republicans. I don't care if they're Cuban heritage or not. They're often called gusanos in the Latino community. Gusano is a Spanish word for worm. And Biden supports them, and Biden met with them. Biden would not meet with any organization that supports the sovereignty or the government of Cuba. And again, I think we have to look at, you know, the idea of democracy. If you're a member of an organization with 186 people in it, and they take a vote to deal with your behavior, and 184 of those people say that you need to stop what you're doing, how can you say you support democracy when you simply refuse to go along with that decision? The United States is a member of the United Nations. They're a member organization. And yet, even in a vote that decisive, they refuse to go along with the decision. The only thing that can stop the blockade, actually, you know, Biden cannot do it unilaterally. It would take a vote in the United States Senate to end the blockade. But there are certainly things that Biden could do. I'm told that there were over 200 executive actions that Donald Trump took against Cuba during his 4 years as president. And so Biden could certainly reverse those and put us back on a course to normal diplomatic relations. And I have to keep bringing up to people that this economic blockade that we have with Cuba does not exist with any other country in the world. We don't blockade Russia, even though they interfered with our democracy. We don't blockade Iran. We don't blockade North Korea, even though we say they all support terrorism. We don't blockade Saudi Arabia, which has no democracy whatsoever and chops up its critics into little pieces, literally. So I think we have to ask ourselves, what is so bad and so evil about Cuba that it's the only country in the world that we are trying to starve into submission? And
Right.
There's no legitimate answer for that.
It's crazy. You know, Patrick, we don't have a lot of time, but I want to get through a couple of quick questions. And then one of the things that you and I have been talking about is about Latinos or Chicanos, African Americans, Asians, and Native Americans, the four groups who've been historically oppressed in this country. And we have the pain and the anguish to demonstrate that. And we also have our history to allude to that. And I see a lot of half-baked Tito Tacos, Uncle Tom, sellout Aunt Jemimas, you name them, handkerchief heads, as Ernie used to call them. I don't even think they're good enough to be a handkerchief head, some of them. They're just dumber than a rock. Sorry, Rock, I didn't mean to insult you. But anyway, the point is, how do we stop our people from being, how do we help ourselves to deal with this white supremacies in many of these education institutions that send our kids into these dead-end situations that they don't grow from? What are some of the, and I like using the term a magic wand, that's my favorite phrase, but from your vantage point, what can we do? Because at times it seems hopeless, and that's kind of my question is, what can we do from your vantage point to reverse this genocidal education or system that, even though we're going to be in the majority, but how can we change it from your vantage point?
Well, I think you and I both have been doing community advocacy to the point where we can identify elements of effective advocacy, and there's a number of them. You know, I used to have a professor, Chicano professor, come in and talk to my students every year in our summer program, and he used to say to them, you know, some of you will be student activists, but most of you will not. It's not really for everybody, realistically. Anybody can be a change agent. Anybody can be a change agent. That's important to know. But the reality is most people of color will not do that. They will not be activists. It's too hard, man, because it requires tenacity. you have to have the tenacity and perseverance of a bulldog. But you also have to, I think, realize there's no shortcuts to effective advocacy. What I'm trying to do with my Chicano colleagues in San Diego, with all these public higher education institutions, is to, as you said, do our homework, to look at what the scholarship on successful Chicano higher education looks like. What are the things that the research clearly shows should be done in colleges and universities to facilitate the success of our students? We know what those answers are. So we need to put that together. We need to approach those institutions and say, look, the scholarship says this is what you should be doing in your colleges and universities. This is how you facilitate success. As you said, you can't have our Chicano students taking all these courses in college taught by white people. They need to have Chicano faculty. They can't have an all-white curriculum and expect to be successful. They need strong Chicano studies. They need services that will connect them. You need to transform the culture to reflect these students and their families. So all these things emerge out of the scholarly literature. We didn't make this up. And so then I think we just have to keep putting it in front of them and keep reminding them, hey, we're the community, you're accountable to us. And we're not going anyplace, man. We're not going to go away until we see that you're making yourselves accountable the way that you should be as professional educators. So
You
I
know,
think a lot of it is, the combination of knowledge and perseverance, tenacity. That's, without those things, you cannot be effective.
Patrick, as you say that, it brings back memories when I was teaching in School of Social Work at UNO, and they let me teach the first African-American family class. And they looked high and wide for an African-American to teach, and particularly they found me. They wanted an African-American male, but they had me teach with an African-American female. And I taught with her the first semester of this course, and we both got evaluated, and it was my first time teaching at UNO, and they rated me real high. And the chair of the department asked me, would I teach it again? I said, yes, under one condition. She says, what is that? I don't teach with this female who doesn't really deal with our struggle from an advocate point of view. Now, she was a nice person, she was a good person, but I didn't want to teach her because when I say something, she would say something, and oftentimes she would contradict what I had to say, particularly from an African-American male perspective, who was an advocate and who was grounded in this community. Fast forward, years later, when they showed me the door, they said, we want to have someone with a degree in social work. And I think they found some single African-American female who had no children or family, and who went along to go along, as they say, as they call them, bobbleheads, as we say in our community. And one of the challenges we face in our community is that we got white folks and white women teaching about African-American and Chicano families who have no families. And I find it funny, it was almost like ironic when I first came back from Africa. I was working at Family Services. There was this woman who was divorced. And she was an African-American. I was talking to her informally in her office. I know she had a degree on the wall. And one of her expertise was marriage counseling. So how does that work? Now, again, I'm not going to say you can't get a divorce if you're a marriage counselor, but I mean, it's like me being, and this happened in Metro, they had a woman who was a fitness guru, and she was like maybe 400 pounds. And people used to question that. How does that work? You make the person who has the worst situations, is that going to motivate her? And my point is, if you've never raised children and stayed up all night with children and raised family, you have no business in the circle of trying to be, I'm not saying you can't be pro-family, but you cannot talk about your lived experience. That's like me, all of a sudden, I want to be talking about how it is to have a child as a woman. Okay, that doesn't work. Or I want to be a Chicano, and again, I can come in and work and help. But at some point, you would think my conscience would kick in and say, let's bring the real deal here, I mean, I'm not The Rock, obviously, so I'm not a weightlifter. But how can I be teaching weightlifting if I can't even lift 10 pounds? And I think that's what's wrong with our bankrupt educational system. You got Black Studies Department, they won't have Malcolm X on the books, and you got all these, matter of fact, they even offered a class on President Obama when he was a president. How does that work? You can run a class on President Obama, but you can't have a course on Malcolm X, was born in Omaha, Nebraska? That's what I'm talking about. So again, until we get some legitimacy and we can, as they say, close ranks, as Carl Michael Turi talks about Hamilton, that we don't close ranks, we're never going to go forward as a people. I was going to ask another question. And again, it goes back to the readings. And I noticed as you were talking, you cited a number of literature sources and so on. And I remember another book that we talked about a while back, 500 Years of Pillage. The guy from President of Venezuela gave a copy of that to President Obama, and it's
Right.
considered a manifesto, a Bible, probably one of the best books that explains how countries in Central and South America got into the conditions they are. In the African country, there's a book called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney. He was from Guyana, and he went and studied for a while in Kenya. When he came back home, he got killed by a bomb in the car. I suspect the CIA man had something to do with that. But talk to me a little bit more about the literature and the books and stuff that you read to help yourself, in books that we need to know if we don't want to get sucked into that other side.
Yeah, I used to talk with some of my colleagues at UC San Diego about this, and it's probably a symptom of the contemporary society where people tend to get their news oftentimes from social media. And I'm sure that there are some people that think, I'm a dinosaur, as they say, a Chicanosaur, because I still read books, man.
Wait, hold on, catch my breath. A Chicanosaur, that's a new one. I never heard of that one.
Chicanosaurus, yes. That I still read books and I still listen to CDs, man. And but to me, there's no substitute for reading. There's no way to know certain things if you're not willing to read. And I had a professor in my doctoral program who was a white woman who actually was pretty down. And one of a handful of white folks, I'd say, I can think of 3 white people I've known in my lifetime that were actually would take risks, on behalf of communities of color. And she was one of them. And she used to be big on doing literature reviews. And she used to say, man, there's no shortcut. If you want to learn about a certain topic or subject, you've got to review the literature, man. You've got to read. And so, yeah, it's absolutely essential. The book you were talking about, it's called The Open Veins of Latin.
Right, The Open Veins, yeah.
By Eduardo Galeano. And yeah, it's a classic text, very painful text. But yeah, there's no way that you can understand what's happening in Latin America today, I think, without that history. And I think that's part of what I also used to teach students in my summer course. We touched a little bit on Marxism. And one of the elements of Marxism that I extracted, I thought was very useful, was the idea that, very basic principle, right? You cannot understand contemporary society or any element of it or dimension of it without knowing the historical context. So, and how do you use historical context? We can't use time machines. You have to read.
As you said that, one of the things that I do in my classes when I was teaching is I would ask people, what are your top 10 books that have shaped your life? And even though I didn't allude to a lot, but I would say Frantz Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth, his book, Black Skin, White Mask, Towards an African Revolution, he's by far one of the best. I love Soledad Brothers, book that he wrote, and also I always got to go with Malcolm X. I mean, that was a classic. The other book that was a profound sleeper for me was Russell Means' book, Where White Men Fail to Tread. I mean, I've never knew that much about Native Americans. And when I started reading his book, I learned about how he evolved, become such a great leader of Native Americans and how he didn't compromise many times. I also love Eldridge Cleveland's Soul on Ice. Those are the old school books in a sense, but those are cutting books. And again, of course, you and I read the book Education and Caste. Abu, the guy who was I think it was an African guy who wrote that book, and he talked about the educational system as a caste system. He died recently, but that was a classic book. So there's a number of books out there. I also love Petals of Blood by Wiongo Tiengo. I think I'm mispronouncing his name. He's from Kenya. He got banned from his country for writing about depression in his country. So my point is, when you start reading these books, it's like that African proverb that knowledge never bends to ignorance. And again, when you know what you know, who's going to come up to you? And I remember some racist woman who was one of my neighbors came to one of my kids when he had this Botswana Bushman piano, and she kept calling it a mousetrap. My son said, no, this is a Bushman piano, Bossaro piano. Like that's an instrument. And she didn't have a clue what she was talking about. Here you have a 7-year-old kid explaining to a Europe-centric or European racist what African culture is. And again, that's what's happened. We bring these artificial people in who haven't done their homework. And it's nothing more painful to me when I'm participating in a book discussion and these ignoramuses come up and they haven't read the book and yet they want to hijack the agenda. And so if you don't read the books, and you can tell that when you're teaching a class, people who don't read the books and they go by your lecture, can I have your lecture? Well, no, read the book. I'm just summarizing and translating some things for you. So again, you got people who get their education from the television and from, watching Jerry Springer and Facebook versus doing it the old fashioned way. Education is not microwave, okay? And so we have to, again, bring the people who come from old school, because many of these young people, particularly I'm gonna go with the Black Lives Matters, some of them have hijacked an agenda that has no continuity to the things of what our ancestors and people went through and what they went through, some of the raw racism. We still got the same racism, but we have to look at books, literature, and also we have to be tested. I just got to arguing with somebody from the Buffett Early Childhood Institution, and the issue was about I hurt somebody's feelings. You got to be kidding. All I said was the person was nervous, talking about racism. If that hurt your feeling, you ought to get out of the playground, because there are a lot more things that will hurt your feeling and your pride than somebody saying they perceive you as being nervous. That's the kind of milquetoast brainwash personalities we got running around here trying to hijack our culture and so on. We're down to our last few minutes, but I just want to, before I close out, just ask you, do you have any closing comments? And also, how can people catch up with some of the literature and the stuff that you have? Have you published it or printed different places if they want to get some of this information or some of the heavy light that you've thrown down during this brief interview?
Actually, I think if they Googled me, they might find some of the things that I wrote. That I think my paper on Cuba should be on the internet, and some other reports that I've written. But again, there's no shortcut. I could throw out a few books and titles and so forth too, but I think people just have to do their homework and do internet searches and as they used to say, snowball. You find one source, and if you like it, if it's good, then check the references out and get some of those, look at their references, and go from there. But yeah, it's critical though, man. I think a lot of people who are activists today that might be somewhat younger than us feel like the era of the 1960s of civil rights and so forth, that's old passe stuff, that those agendas, those objectives, and even the strategies are out of date. And it's time to be more conciliatory and that I don't agree with that at all. So I think there's still a lot to be learned from that.
Well, Dr. Patrick Velasquez, I really appreciate you sharing it. And one of the things I will close out is that we only have to do reverse engineering. As they say in Africa, that if you go to a classroom and all the students are failing, you don't go to the students, you go to the teacher. And that's what happens in the United States. We get automatic A's given to many of our kids, and some of them have not even attended class. Some of them have not been battle tested, and therefore we get these lightweights and heavy and dead weights and featherweights, and they don't be able to go forward. They're not able to go forward. So we need to look at using maybe the critical race theory lens to say, how is it that, as Malcolm says, when your opponent is always winning, it means he's always cheating? So we need to look at the historical oppression. We need to talk about reparations. We need to talk about a proportionality. If we make up 30% of the population, should we at least have 10 people at the table in a sense? But we should not have the kind of negativity that is impacting our communities and the self negativity that is hurting us today. So really appreciate you coming on today, and we will post this on our webpage as well as YouTube for people to watch it. And hopefully we'll have you come back and talk about some other issues impacting the Latino, Chicano, Hispanic, and we say different terminologies that we use to bring our worlds together. Because I think when we come together, as that African proverb goes, when we bring folks together, we unite, and no one can come through us. So thank you very much for being here.
Sure, my pleasure.
So we will go from there, and we hope to join us again next time.